Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm super excited to collaborate with Altenew and share two easy die ink techniques. I'm using two different die sets. I have the mini flower cluster layering die set for the floral element and the simple greetings die set for the sentiment for each of the two cards that I'm creating. I'm using the Deco Garden Fresh Die mini ink pad set for my color palette. And then for one card, I'm using the detailed blending brushes set here. There's three different brushes in three different sizes. And then for the second card, I'll be using the Altenew water brush. This holds water in the handle, so you don't have to have a jar of water nearby. Perfect for me. I tend to be a klutz, so I would spill a jar of water nearby. So having the water in the brush is perfect. I have my die cut pieces stuck on my well-loved Altenew sticky mat here. I am using the blending brushes to blend the ink onto the cardstock. So I'm starting off with the mild yellow, using it for the center of the flowers on the solid die cut, and then for the inside of the flowers on the upper layer of the die set. So I'm going to use a variety of the different inks just to color the different pieces of flowers. I've laid them out on my sticky mat kind of in order of how they layer together. This is going to make it really easy when I go to layer my pieces together and assemble those flowers. I'm also using the mild yellow on the tips of some of the leaves. So we have a limited color palette here, and I want to use only the colors that I have in this palette. So I'm using a combination of the mild yellow, the olive, as well as the navy for the leaves. Once I'm done with that mild yellow, I'm going in with the olive. Now the leaves have 2 or 3 different layers depending on the cluster of leaves. So on the upper layers, I'm going to use more of the mild yellow with the olive. On the lower layers, I'm going to be using the olive with the navy. I'm not going to be using the navy on its own. It's going to go over top of the olive. So it just kind of blends together to create a darker green. And I'm blending the colors together because we have different layers that go on top of each other. We don't need to be absolutely perfect with our blending. I just want to have a color variation. I don't want to have the leaves to be all the same color or the flowers to be all the same color. I love using white cardstock and using inks and blending them together to create different varieties of the color, as well as have lighter and darker areas to create different shades and depths of those colors. Now, if this is not your cup of tea, you could use colored cardstock and just cut the different pieces out of colored cardstock and then layer them together. However, I do think using white cardstock and using inks to blend those cardstocks give you a really unique look. The great thing about using ink is you can customize each one of those leaf clusters or flower clusters. You could use the same colors of ink, but use a little bit more of one color, a little bit less of others in order to get a unique look for each one. Now, the sticky mat really helps when you're doing this because it holds those pieces in place while you're blending on them. It's a lot harder to blend on smaller die cuts if you have to hold them with your hands. Once I'm done with the olive, I'm going to use the navy, and I'm just going to do the lower part of the leaf, the part of the leaf that would typically attach to the stem. And I'm just going to blend over that olive ink just a little bit, just to darken that color a little bit, to make it look like a little bit of a darker green. I'm also going to be using the navy on those little tiny squiggly pieces right in the center left of my mat. Those are for the centers of the flowers, and I want a pop of a contrasting color that I'm not using for the rest of the flowers on them. So I'm going to be using that navy. It'll tie everything together. And then lastly, I'm going to be using the navy on the shadow part of my hello sentiment. Now, before we get too far, I also want to mention that Altenew is sponsoring 2 $15 gift certificate giveaways. I will post the winner in a week on this post, on this video. In order to enter into the giveaway, you need to follow me. You need to follow Altenew, as well as comment on this post. There's going to be more or all the details on how to enter the giveaway in the description of this video. Also in the description, you'll find a list of the Altenew supplies that I'm using to create these cards. So the next color that I'm using for the next layer of my floral cluster is the coral red from the Deco Garden Fresh Die mini ink set. This is a nice bright coral color, and it's going to add a nice pop of color to our flower cluster. This is going to be on one of the lower levels, so you can see a lot of the color here on this level, but there's going to be layers on top of it. So we're not going to see as much as you see on that flower cluster. On the next cluster, I'm using the same color, and I'm just putting a touch of it on the edges of the petals. I'm going to be blending it into the next color, which is Dusty Paint. But I always love it when I'm doing florals to have petals that have some dark to light areas, or light to dark. Sometimes I'll do the dark on the edges and the tips of the petals like I'm doing here. Other times I'll do to the dark areas where the petal meets the center of the flower. It's entirely up to you. Neither one is right or wrong. There's florals in both ways. I do just like the look of having those two different colors together. So once I'm done with that coral red on the outside, I'm just using that dusty pink to fill in the area, going right over top of that coral red, blending those two colors together. Then I'm using that same dusty pink on the upper layer of the petals. Now this is the one where I put some of the mild yellow on it. So I'm putting the dusty pink on the opposite side of where I put that mild yellow. I don't want to completely cover that yellow. I want to still see a little bit of a pop of the yellow. I think that yellow is going to add a nice contrast to the pinks and corals, and they're going to coordinate nicely with it. And I think by using the pinks with the yellow, it's going to have a little bit of a tropical flower look to it. So when I'm using detailed blending brushes, it really depends on what I'm blending as to how I blend. On those florals, on that upper layer of the florals, I just kind of used a streaking motion. I was heavier where the paper was white, and then I just lifted my brush and kind of flicked my brush towards where I had put that mild yellow ink. But when it came to the upper layer of that sentiment, I went in a circular motion to completely cover it with that dusty pink. Now on that sentiment, I want to create a bit of an ombre look, so I'm using the coral red, and I'm just kind of flicking my brush up from the bottom. This way I have a nice blend between the two colors because I'm heavier where I start, and then as my brush flicks up, I'm using less ink, so it kind of blends into each other. Another option here would be to use that coral red and then go back over again with that dusty pink to blend it even further, but I didn't find that was necessary. Now, anytime I'm assembling die cuts, I like to use a liquid glue in order to assemble them. That way you have that wiggle room to move and shimmy those die cuts in place and make sure that you have perfect placement with them. Now, sometimes I'll pull my die cuts off of my sticky mat, but I found lately that by leaving them on my sticky mat, it keeps them organized. I don't have to reorganize them on my work surface, and I can just assemble it right with the base of it on that sticky mat. Sometimes I'll lift it up and sometimes I'll just leave the base right there. By putting the glue down and then putting my piece right on top of it, it gives it that time to just sit and dry. Now, depending on the pieces that I'm using, sometimes I'll also use a large acrylic block on there just to weight everything down. Sometimes it doesn't really need that, but often I will do that just to hold everything down nice and flat while I'm adding glue to another piece. Once I've put those 4 top layers onto my flowers, I'm ready to add the center pieces. Now, I did use the front of the die package in order to show me exactly where those pieces went, and they fit in there nicely like a glove, but it's not really intuitive for those center pieces. So by using the die package as a reference, it made it really easy to put those pieces in there and know which way they're supposed to be orientated, simply because they're all facing different directions. So it's easier to just reference that, and it's a great way to put them together nice and easily. So once I have my floral cluster together, I put it to the side. I'll do the second one off screen because it's exactly the same as the first one. And now I'm ready to start assembling my leaves. And once we add those different layers, the floral cluster as well as the leaves really start coming together, and you really start seeing all of the detail to it. I love the amount of contrast we got on those leaves because of putting the navy on the base on the bottom layer and then the yellow on the tips on the upper layer. You really get a lot of contrast between that mild yellow, the olive, and the navy. So just because you have a really limited color palette doesn't mean you can't get a lot of contrast. I definitely recommend taking a look at your colors and seeing which ones can blend together easy and creating more colors out of it by doing that. So once I have my leaves together, I will assemble the sentiment here, and it's really easy to assemble that sentiment. It just centers on the top of that shadow piece. Once again, using that liquid glue so that I can put it on the back. And I try to use as little as possible, especially with the sentiment, because I don't want that glue exposed on the ink because it will affect the ink a little bit. Now I did the second set of leaves as well as the second set of florals off screen, and now I'm ready to start assembling my card. I have a mat here that I trimmed to 4 inches by 5¼ inches, and I'm just using that navy pad to ink around the outside edges of that mat. This is the perfect way to get an exact match to the colors that you were using for the florals. Anytime I'm using inks to color my die cuts, I'll often use my ink pads in order to color the mats because it gives you that exact match. Then I die cut or trimmed down a piece of cardstock to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches for my centerpiece. I want my florals to be on a nice bright white to show off those colors. Then I can assemble my florals. Now I did 2 clusters of florals here, and I also do 2 clusters for my second card. You could do 3 if you want, but I love the look of those florals on that white space there. Once I have the florals in there, I can go and tuck in my leaves. I do find that by putting the florals down first, it gives me an idea of where I need to fill in the different areas. You could, if you wanted, put your leaves on there first and then put your florals on the front. But by using that liquid glue, you still have that wiggle room to really easily tuck in those leaves, and you can put them where you want. And I typically will try put them in different areas for the 2 clusters so they don't look like they're a copy paste of each other. Then I added the sentiment to the middle right just to fill in that area as well. And we have our first card done. And because of the ink and ink blending on the white cardstock, you get a really unique look. Like I said earlier in this video, you could use solid cardstocks and die cut the different layers, but it would be really hard to use a solid cardstock and ink blend between that mild yellow and the dusty pink color. There's not really an easy way to do that with solid cardstock. So when you use white cardstock, it makes it really easy. For the second card, I have very similar die cuts here, but this is watercolor cardstock because I'm going to use that water brush in order to watercolor those die cut pieces. In order to create my color palette, I'm just going to be smushing those ink pads onto my work surface and use those as my color palette for watercoloring in my leaves as well as watercoloring in my florals. Now, I mentioned earlier that this water brush has water in the handle, so it makes it really easy when I put my inks on my surface to use as a palette. I can just squeeze that handle a little bit to get some water in with those inks. And if I need to change colors, I have a piece of paper towel to my right, you can't see it on screen, that I can just squeeze the handle of that brush and it will flush water through the bristles and clean the color that is in the brush out. If I find that I have too much water on my brush, I can just tap it on that paper towel and it will suck that water out. So I find using a brush like this, I have a lot of control over how much water I have. It makes it really, really easy to change those colors. And like I mentioned earlier with this, I tend to be a bit of a klutz. So if I had a jar of water on my desk, there's a really good chance I would spill it. By doing this, it takes very little supplies and it's very nice, or it's nice and clean, and I don't risk either tipping the water over or drinking paint water. So I love brushes like these with the water in the handle. I find them so easy to use and so convenient to use. If I need more ink, I just smush my ink pad, that little ink cube, onto the palette. These are new pads. They're really quite juicy. They have a lot of ink in them. And the great thing about dye inks is they are water soluble. So it's really easy to use dye inks to watercolor your pieces. This just gives you another use for your dye inks. You could just use it for ink blending, and if you're happy with that, that's great. But I always love when supplies can be used in more than one way. And this is a really, really easy way to also create some custom colors because I can put that olive on my palette or on my mat, put the navy right beside it, and I can blend those two together really, really easily to create a new shade of green. And it's just a little bit easier than ink blending the blue over top of the olive because I could create that color on my mat there and then add it to the cardstock. And so we can get a larger color range with this because we can custom make colors. Now, when we're custom making these colors, it's really hard to duplicate the exact same shade, but because we're watercoloring, those colors are going to blend and bleed together into each other anyways. So I don't really need to worry about that. Now, just like before, I did 2 of each of the die cuts of the flowers, 2 of each of the die cuts of the leaves. For this particular card, I'm going to use the thanks for the sentiment because the Simple Greetings die set had 4 different words to choose from. We have hello, hugs, you, and thanks. So you could choose either the hello, the hugs, or the thanks as a single word, or you could do hello, you, thanks, you, to create a 2-word sentiment on there. So you have a few different options just from that one set. Now, just like my last card, I used the navy ink for the shadow for my sentiment, as well as for those little curly pieces for the centers of my flowers. Now, I wanted this one to have a little bit more of a tropical vibe to it. So I'm using the pool ink in this set to do the bases or the center parts of my flowers. And then I'm using it on the upper layer of those flower pieces just around the outside edges before pulling in that mild yellow and blending it in with that pool color. Now, as I was watercoloring the flowers as well as the leaves, I'm trying to work fairly quickly. I don't want one color of my ink to dry before adding the next color. I want them to kind of blend together. I can also go over the entire piece with some water just to rehydrate both colors to help them blend with each other just a little bit more. But that's the great thing about using watercolor cardstock and inks that are water soluble, is you can get some really interesting looks that you can't get with ink blending. You can get a similar-ish look with ink blending, but it still looks a little bit different. The inks blend a little bit different because we've added water. There's a little bit of a different color tone as well. So I definitely encourage, if you have dye inks to play with, try them in both ways. It's always fun to see the different colors you can create, the different ways that the inks blend with each other, and just the different looks that you can create. For the second layer from the top, I'm using the dusty pink ink and coloring it all over that die cut. You can see that it's really easy to just grab my ink pad, smush it right back onto my mat. If I don't seem to have enough ink, I can just add some more and add water to it. Around the outside edges, I'm using the coral red just to add a little bit of color variety to those petals. And then I'm using that coral red on the next layer as well. But because we've mixed it with water, you can see that there's a different color tone that we get from this coral red than we had for the first card, because that was just the color on its own. To add a little bit of a difference, I went and grabbed the navy and put a little bit around the outside of this piece here. We're not going to see a ton of that when we assemble our pieces together, because a lot of that does get covered by upper die cuts. But I just wanted to add something just a little bit different, a little bit not expected. And I knew a lot of it was going to be covered up. We were only going to see just a tiny little bit of it. Now, we did use water. We used watercolor cardstock. So I made sure that that was completely dry before assembling it. If you don't wait till watercolor cardstock is completely dry, it continues to dry while your pieces are glued together, and you tend to get curved pieces or warped pieces. So best to make sure that they're completely dry before adding glue and assembling them. Because we used watercolor and watercolor cardstock, it does have a little bit of a warp to it. So I am using my acrylic block to hold those layers down while the different layers are gluing together, because I want to make sure that they stay nice and flat. I'm just using that same liquid glue in order to glue those pieces. I really love the look of that dusty pink on the lower levels with that mild yellow and the pool on the upper levels. It really gives it a completely different look. The great thing about using floral die cuts when you're creating is you can go with traditional colors on what the plants are intended to be or what they traditionally look like, or you can get really creative and use non-traditional colors. There's really no right or wrong, but you get to have fun playing, mixing colors, seeing what you like, seeing what you don't like. You're not always going to love everything you like, but that's part of the fun of it, because sometimes you'll put something together that you didn't think you were going to like and you end up loving it. So here are my two clusters. I put one together off screen because it's exactly the same as the other one and there was a lot of repetition to it. Then I can assemble my leaves. Now, once again, with those leaves, there's a third layer, which is a tiny little piece, and I used the die package in order to know exactly where those pieces layered. The great thing about layering die cuts is they add a lot of detail and dimension to your pieces very easily. Some people are a little bit intimidated by pieces that have a lot of die cuts to them. What I like to do is lay them all out before I start to assemble, so I know I have all of those pieces ready to go. I can see exactly which piece goes next. I find it mentally calming when I have everything laid out and I know which piece is next. I know where it is. And just do one piece at a time. It seems overwhelming at first, especially if you have something that has a lot of pieces to it. But as you start to assemble, you get really excited because you see all that detail that is created. For this card, I'm going to use that pool for my matte piece, and that matte piece is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. My upper layer is going to be trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. And I'm going to change the layout of the flowers just a little bit for this card. Once again, if you wanted to have more florals on your front, you could do 3 clusters of flowers and just fill it up a little bit more. But I always love the look of the white space in the background as well. And I didn't want to have my card kind of overwhelmed with florals. So for this card, I'm using them a little bit more vertically rather than horizontally, kind of doing a vertical arrangement. And once again, just like the last one, I'm gluing the flowers down first, and then I'm tucking in the leaves where I feel it makes sense to have leaves to fill in that space. And I typically will try to not put those leaves in exactly the same spot in each cluster, just to give them a little bit of uniqueness. I don't want to copy paste of each piece. I want them to look like a larger cluster altogether. Once I have all of those leaves in place, I can add my sentiment. I do like that sentiment in the middle there, especially for these two cards, but you could put it on the bottom if you wanted. I just kind of feel like it fits right over those clusters of flowers. So here is the watercolored version, and it has a completely different look to it than our ink blended piece because the colors just are a little bit more muted. They still have some nice bright color to them, but they're not quite as bright as the first one because we added water to those inks. Here is the second one with the ink blended version. You'll find all of the supplies I've used listed and linked down in the description box below, and don't forget about the giveaway. There's the instructions for that here as well, and I'll be posting the winners for that giveaway on this post in a week, which will be on April 15th. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.